Hi everyone, I'm Carolina and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be making an adore dress. I have 3 of them behind me and I'm going to be making the top version today. So I'm going to have smock in the back on mine. I'm going to do it with a circle skirt, no sleeves, and make shoulder ties on the shoulder because I think that's the most detailed and intricate options. So if you want to make it with sleeves, for example, gathered skirt or no smock in the back, don't worry, because it's all in the instructions. And if you have any questions and I'm not talking about it in this video, then feel free to message me and I'm always happy to help. And as always, you can download this pattern on my website, studiocarolinashirring.com. I'm also going to link it down below in the description for you. And if you want to see the behind the scenes, the making of the sewing pattern, like all the decision making behind it, you can check out the sewing vlog for the adore dress, and I'm gonna link it somewhere here in a corner, we'll see. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And also, if you make this piece, please tag me on Instagram at studiocarolinashirring and post a picture with the hashtag #SeeUsAdoreDress so that I can see all your lovely creations. All right, let's get into it. So I'm not gonna go through all the pieces that you need for this pattern because it's in the pattern file on page 6, cutting sheet. So check that for what pieces you need and cut 1 centimeter seam allowance on all pieces. And all lining pieces can be cut in main fabric as well. That's what I'll be doing for this tutorial. I'm also gonna do a little thing with the bust pieces that I will explain to you when I get there. So the supplies that you need is some light to medium weight fabric. I'm going to be using a medium weight viscose linen blend for this. That was difficult to say. You can use lightweight interfacing on pieces 1, 2, and 3 if you want some extra structure in the bodice part. You definitely don't need to do that. I haven't done it on any of these dresses, and I'm not going to do it on the top that I'm sewing today, but if you want to do that for more structure, you can do that. You're also going to be needing some sewing thread and an invisible zipper. So if you're making the dress, you need an invisible zipper that measures 35 centimeters, that is 14 inches, and the top 30 centimeters or 12 inches. You're also going to be needing binding to cover your zipper edge on the back. So I haven't pictured it here because I'm going to be cutting my own binding from my main fabric, which you can do. Or you can buy a pre-made binding or a ribbon, you could use that as well. So this is just to visualize where all the pieces go. This is my front, and I'm going to sew this with a lining between my lining fabric and my main fabric. So I'm gonna have, on the bust part, I'm gonna have 3 layers, and I'm just gonna use a white cotton there. So I don't need this for this fabric, but I did it for these 2 dresses because the fabrics are a lot thinner and see-through. So this is what you could do if you want to make the dress out of a sheer fabric. Then you could just add an extra layer on the bust part. So that's what I'm doing it here, just to kind of show you how you could solve that issue. I mean, that is if you don't want to have it see-through. Like if you want to have it see-through, then, you know, free the nipple. And then you have the front skirt, which I'm doing in circle skirt. For the back, I have my back pieces, I have my invisible zipper there, and then I have 2 halves of the skirt. Then I have my straps, so I have 4 sets of 2 straps, 8 straps in total. So first step is to sew my pieces 1, 2, and 3 together, main fabric and lining separately. And I'm going to sew them with a straight stitch and then just iron those seams open. Here I'm showing you a little corner that you will have when cutting the pattern. Just cut that corner off. You don't need it. So here I have my main fabric and my lining, which I'm doing in the same fabric. So I have main fabric and lining. Now iron all of those seams open. Here I'm showing you that I did a little mark to say that this is my lining, so I wouldn't get confused. Okay, now we're going on to the bust part. This is piece number 5. So this is my main fabric piece. And then I will put my cotton piece, my white cotton, on top of the main fabric. It's important that it goes on top of the main fabric when I sew it and not together with the lining, because if it goes with the lining then, and you're doing it in a sheer fabric, then the seam allowance will be visible through the main fabric. Okay, main fabric in between lining. Then you want those seam allowances to be together, and then you want the lining seam allowance, because otherwise If you do it the other way around, then your sheer main fabric, you'll see the seam allowance through that. So main fabric plus in between lining and then lining. And I'll sew it together on the neckline curve. Obviously, you don't have to have that in between lining. It's not mentioned in the pattern. This is just like tips and tricks from me to you. So here I have my in-between lining, my main fabric, and my lining. Sew that together with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance like everywhere else. Now, iron that seam open, then over to the lining side. So over to not the in-between lining side, but to the lining side, and then understitch it on the lining side. So your understitch is not visible from the outside on the main fabric. And that's what that looks like. Gorgeous, beautiful, great. Quality work, I would say. So these are pieces number 5. This is how it's gonna look when it's folded. So they look kind of like, I don't know, weird butterflies now, but it's a part of the process. Follow along and it's gonna look like bust cups. So now I'm going to gather the top of my number 5 pieces by doing 2 gathering stitches next to each other and then pull my under thread. And I want to do this when my pieces are open, flat. That's what it should look like. You should have 2 gathering stitches really close to each other within the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then just pull the under thread to gather it. And that's what it looks like. You have piece L5, 5, and then you have that like in between lining with piece 5. And gathered open. Continuing to sewing the back pieces. So I'm going to take piece 4 and L4 and I'm going to sew them together on the top edge. This is regardless if you're doing smock or no smock. So I'm just gonna pin them together on the top edge there and sew them together with a straight stitch. Then I will iron that seam open. Here I'm showing that this is my lining piece. I know which one is my lining and which one is my main fabric, in case you were wondering. So yeah, iron it open and then I will iron the seam allowance over to the lining side. So over to L4. And then I'll understitch it on the lining side. So understitch, seam allowance to piece L4. Now I'm doing mine with smock in the back. If you're not doing yours with smock in the back, you can go ahead and skip this drawing step and go straight to step 8. So now I'm going to draw on my smock lines with a friction pen, which is a heat sensitive pen. So when I steam it, it's gonna just disappear. So you wanna use one of those or chalk to mark your smock lines. When you're drawing your lines, you want to start at 0.5 centimeters from the top line of piece 4 and then 1 centimeter in between each line from there. And you want to draw on the main fabric side because you need to see when you sew. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Whoa, some magic right there. To sew smock, you want to sew with a bobbin of elastic thread. So you want to wind your elastic thread by hand around your bobbin, because if you wind it with your machine winder, it's gonna be too tight, which is gonna stretch out the elastic and then not have the desired effect of your smock. And I'm going to insert my bobbin into my under thread holder case. As usual, I'm just gonna put that in my machine as I would normally do with a non-elastic thread. Just same procedure as every time. So now I have my over thread, my upper thread is non-elastic and my under thread is elastic. Then I will change my stitch length to max. For this fabric on my machine, it's stitch length max to get the best smock result, but it depends on machine to machine and fabric to fabric. So you have to do a little test piece here, but play around with the stitch length. Usually it's good between 4 or 5, so pretty much max. You also might need to change the tension of your under thread. I don't have to do it now, like it was good for me, but if you're having issues, check the tension. So then I will start sewing at the top line. I'll do a little back stitch in the beginning, and then I will sew along that line, take my, sew off the fabric, no back stitch, but sew off the fabric, take my presser foot up, move it to the second line, and then continue sewing. If I do a back stitch between every single line, then that's gonna get in the way of the elastic effect of that elastic thread. So I don't want to do that. And you can see as I'm sewing that my fabric is becoming more and more gathered with the more lines I sew. And at the end, I will do a back stitch as well when I've done all of my lines. And this is what my smock looks like. So you see that I still have those friction pen lines, and I will now just put it on, I'll pin it onto my ironing board like this. Even if you did it with chalk, you need to do this. You need to steam your smock afterwards to get it to look even and just be a little tighter, you know? So I recommend steaming it. Don't iron it, because then you might melt your elastic thread. Just steam on top of it, and it's gonna give your smock a nicer look, more even finish. And this is what the inside looks like. So you can see the elastic thread there. All right, now I'm going to insert my pieces for L4 into between my main fabric and my lining of my piece 3 and L3. You can see that my back piece, my piece 4L4, has a curved bottom. And at the longest point, that is my center back. And the shortest point, like where it curves up, that is what is connected to piece 3L3. And then I will align the top of my back piece with the notch on my piece 3. So I'm pinning it in place, making sure that the outer side of my back is aligning to the outer side of my main fabric. All right, that's what it looks like. I'm just going to stitch that together with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance, like everywhere else. So now I have my back piece, my piece 4L4, sandwiched in between my pieces 3L3. I'm just going to iron that seam open. Careful now again not to iron straight on top of your elastic threads. And then iron it towards the lining side, and then understitch it on the lining side. And there you have it. I have some elastic threads there hanging loose because I had to change my bobbin when I was sewing my smock, but disregard those, they're not important. Okay, so now we're going on to the shoulder straps. Here I have my strap. I'm going to sew it on the shorter edge and the angle upwards, and not sew on the longer edge. So just pinning together what I'm going to sew, do that times 4 because you have 4 straps. 1 centimeter seam allowance, straight stitch like everywhere. And that's what it looks like. You can see here that only one of the sides is sewn. Here I have a corner, like a peak. Cut that off, you don't need it. Also, if you don't cut it off, it's gonna get bulky and not be pointy. So cut it off. Obviously, don't cut in your seam, just cut the excess fabric off. Iron this open. And even that little angle there, iron it open. Then with my top of my scissor close, I'm just gonna point that corner out. Could use a pen for this. Yeah, I'm just using a scissor. And then iron it flat. Now I'm going to sew the straps to my pieces number 5, L5. So I'll sew the straps to the gathered edge of the pieces number 5, L5, and I'll sew it with the seam allowance open on the straps. And I will align my seams together. And I'm doing that by just putting a pin in the seam and then kind of making sure that it goes through the seam of the other piece. Here, I'll show you what I mean. So you can see that I'm putting the pin inside both of the seams, like aligning them with my pin. So if the pin goes through both of the seams, then you know that when you sew over it, it's gonna be a clean angle joining point between your seams. Leave an end of 1 centimeter on your pieces L5-5 that is not gathered. So just 1 centimeter flat there, because that's gonna be your seam allowance later on. I'll just also pin my seam allowance open here so I'm sure that it lays flat. And now sew that with 1 centimeter seam allowance and a straight stitch. Do the exact same thing on the other side. And then for the back, it's the exact same procedure, aligning your seams with your pin so you make sure that you get a clean joining point and pin it with the seam allowance open on the straps, edge to edge. Again, just pinning my seam allowance open here. Doing the same thing on the other side. And then sewing that with a straight stitch at 1 centimeter. Then iron the seam allowance flat and up into the strap on both the front and the back pieces. Now I will sew the armhole up to the top of the strap. So I'm just going to pin the sides, the curve of the piece 5L5 together up to the strap point. And then I will sew that with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance. And doing the same thing on the back. So on the back, I will start from like the peak point of piece number 2 before it goes into the bust curve. And here I'm also pinning the seam allowance between piece 2 and 3 and L2 and L3 open. That's how it looks, just sew that together. Then you have another corner on the top of the strap that you want to cut off again. Then iron the seam open and over to the lining side, and we're gonna do another understitch. Like, you might struggle to iron this open, then just like, don't do that. Just, you know, sew it, understitch it, folding it manually, that's fine too. And when you understitch it, maybe you don't get all the way up to the shoulder point connection with the strap. That's okay, like go as far as you can, and that's gonna be enough to keep the lining in place. And then we're going to flip all of it inside out. We're going to flip that strap inside out. I use a chopstick to do that. If you have a better tool, then you're welcome to use that. Here, I'm also just using a pin to kind of carefully pick out my pointy end there to the strap. Then iron that all flat. Same thing on the back, flip right sides out and iron it flat. This is what my bust pieces looks like now. This is piece number 5 connected to piece number 7, which is the strap. And now I'm going to gather the bottom of my piece number 5. I'm going to gather it, all of the layers together, and I'm gathering from the center front to my gather notch. But I'm pinning the entire curve together just to, you know, keep the curve, the fabric not bulky or pleated anywhere. I'm just pinning it all together, but I'm still only gonna gather to my gathered notch. So here I'm just pulling my under thread. I've gathered it the same way as I did before, 2 gathering stitches within my seam allowance. And that's what it looks like. Now I'm going to attach my bust pieces to my bodice pieces. So here I have them laid together, how it should look, and my seam that connects my piece number 2 to piece number 1 is going to align with my gathering notch on my piece number 5. So I'm just gonna flip it out, and my side, my corner of my piece number 5, L5, is going to align to that corner of my piece number 2, L2. And then my center front is going to align with the peak on piece 1, L1. So I'm sandwiching the armhole seam of my piece 5, L5 between my piece 2, L2. So I'm just pinning it together here. I'm sandwiching piece 5, L5 in between my lining and my main fabric layer of my body pieces. I'm pinning the seam allowance open between piece 2 and 1, L2 and L1. Then when I get to the peak of my piece, like the center of my piece 1, L1, I'm going to draw in my seam allowance there. I'm just going to draw in like a triangle following the seam allowance of that peak. And I do that to be able to align my piece, my bust cups, like exactly where they need to be to get a nice joining point here. So this is what my markings look like. And this is just my seam allowance, right? The space, like this is where the line is, that is where my seam will go. So now I know where exactly my piece L55 needs to stop in order to be in the center of my piece 1, L1. So that's what I'm doing here. You can see that I haven't pinned it edge to edge, I've pinned it to the line. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other bust cup. So again, just sandwiching the piece 5L5 in between the armhole seam there of piece 2L2, pinning it along the whole curve. Now I'm aligning my second bust cup with those markings that I did. So again, not pinning edge to edge, just pinning to where my line is. Where those two pieces join, that is my center line of my front. And now I will just place my other layer on top of that. I find it easier to do on one layer and then just put the other layer of my lining or whatever on top of it, so that I know that it's well aligned, like I can see it before sandwiching it completely. Here I've also just drawn on that layer to visualize, and you can also do that because then you know exactly where to sew. So this is what it looks like with that entire curve pinned together, a lot of pins, a lot of fabric, and now I'm just going to sew that entire curve. And when I get to the peak point, I am just going to pivot there, like to the peak point of piece 1L1. I'm just going to sew along that line that I drew, pivot, and continue along the curve of the other half. And flip it inside out, and this is what it looks like. Looking pretty good. So this is on my inside. You can see my understitch there on my bust cups. And this is what the connection looks like between my piece 5 and 2, or L5 and L2. Here, it could get a little bulky there and also in the center. So if your fabric is medium weight, a little bit thicker, you can cut all of the seam allowance off. Just iron that flat. And now we're moving on to the skirt. I'm just gonna put my skirt pieces out and sew my side seams together. Of course, if you are doing pockets, follow the written instructions for how to attach your pockets before you close your side seams. In this video, I am going to close my side seams with French seams. So I'm going to pin my wrong sides together first, so on the right side, and then flip it the other way around and close it on the wrong side. You can also sew this together with a straight stitch. If you're doing that, then you should overlock the side seams first. Since I'm doing French seams, I don't need to overlock these edges. In the written instructions, I have written to overlock your center back seam now, which you can do. You can totally do that. In this tutorial, I am overlocking it at a later step together with the center back seam of my bodice, which technically you don't have to overlock that edge because it's going to be hidden behind the zipper with the binding. But in this video, I'm doing it. I'm just mentioning that so you don't get confused, but you can overlock your center back seam of the skirt now or later when I do it in the tutorial. Now I will iron that seam open. Flip it over and iron it flat. So this is now my wrong side of my fabric. And then I will sew a straight stitch there at 5 millimeters from the edge. No, that's 7 millimeters from the edge, making it seam allowance of 1 centimeter. And that's my French seam. My raw edge of the fabric is not visible. Even if you do pockets, you can do it with a French seam. But also you don't have to do a French seam. You can totally just do that straight stitch. Now I will attach my skirt to my bodice. So my center front notch on my skirt goes to my center front notch of my bodice. Then I also have a notch matching with the seam on my bodice between piece 1 and 2. And then I have my side seams matching each other. If I do French seams, I want my seam allowance to be folded backwards. If I do not have pockets, if I have pockets, I want my seam allowance folded front so that my pockets fall to the front. If I do straight stitch, I want my seam allowance open. Then I also have a notch to match up with the seam connecting piece 4 and 3. And then my center back, I just connect with my center back. If you're sewing the gathered skirt, you obviously need to gather it before you attach it to the bodice. So just follow the instructions for that in the written instructions. If I have smock as my back piece, I want to stretch out the smock and pin it together with the skirt to keep the full width of the smock. Now I will sew that connecting seam with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance, like everywhere else. And here I'm just showing off that my side seams match. This is the part where I'm going to overlock my center back seam, and you can see that I do it with my skirt already attached to my smock, which you can totally do it this way or the way that it's written in the instructions. Like, it makes zero difference. But if you do it this way, when the skirt is already connected to the bodice, you need to have the seam allowance of that connection going downwards when you overlock it. So here I'm just ironing that seam allowance downwards towards the skirt. The raw edge of the bodice and skirt connection, I will just overlock that as well. And overlocking my center back seam. All right, here we go. We are almost done. So I'm going to attach my zipper in my center back seam, and I'm going to align my little plastic thingy there at the top with the top of my smock, my back piece. So just aligning those two, pinning my zipper in place. Also, disclaimer, my zipper is too long. I didn't have a zipper the correct length, and I wasn't about to go out and buy one just for this. So you can use a zipper that's too long, just cut off the excess, like attach it and then cut it off. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna use my super long zipper and then just, you know, figure it out later on. And from my waist, where the connection between the skirt and the bodice, I will measure out where my zipper needs to end. If I'm doing a top version, my zipper needs to end 14 centimeters down from the waist seam. If I'm doing a dress, it needs to end 18 centimeters down from the waist seam. First, I will sew a basting stitch to just lock my zipper in place so I can remove my pins and then sew my zipper stitch really close to the zipper teeth. So here I'm just sewing my basting stitch. It doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to look good. Then removing my pins, sewing my zipper stitch, folding my teeth of the zipper open, and just sewing really close in that crease of the teeth. Then I will mark out all of my seams on the zipper. So my waist seam, and then I'm going to mark out my top on the zipper and my end on the zipper. This is just to make sure that my zipper aligns straight so that I can, when I pin it over to the other side, I pin it like corresponding to those lines. So when I close my zipper, my waist is leveled at the same place, my top is leveled, and my bottom is leveled. So just pinning the other side of the zipper to the other side of my back, aligning the seams with the lines that I just drew. And then doing a basting stitch, removing my pins, and doing my zipper stitch. And this is what it looks like, so barely visible. Obviously, when you wear your garment and the smock is gonna stretch out a little bit, you're gonna see the invisible zipper there in between. Now for the bottom. So I am just going to sew this bottom shut. So I'm just pinning the edges together, sewing with a straight stitch up to where my zipper stitch ends, just passing it a little bit, like a couple of millimeters, not too much, because now you're gonna struggle with, you know, getting into your garment. And then iron it open. And then this is also when I'll just cut off the excess of my zipper there at the bottom. And you can finish this different ways. I'm just gonna zigzag that close. I'm gonna zigzag it perpendicular to the zipper teeth. Now to my binding. So I've cut my binding in my main fabric, and I am going to overlock one vertical end on both of them. And now I am just going to cover this seam allowance from my zipper with my binding pieces. But the first thing I do, I need to fold down the top of my zipper. So you could either cut this off. I prefer to fold it down because I think that gives a nicer finish. So I fold it down like a little triangle, pin that in place. Then I will align my non-overlock side of the binding with the edge of the zipper, like with the seam allowance edge. I will fold down the top of my binding over it, just like this, and then I will pin that in place and pin it along the entire edge of the zipper. So the length of the binding and the instructions cover the smock piece. It covers the bodice piece. If you want your binding to be longer, then use a longer piece. Like, this is up to you. You choose how long your binding is. My binding in the video is slightly longer because, okay, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't really measure it, I just kind of cut it. So my binding is longer than my bodice piece and goes down towards my skirt, but I kind of recommend to only have the binding go to your waist seam, maybe just a little bit past it, because if you're doing it in a flowy fabric, then maybe you're gonna have a little bump there on the zipper if your binding is thick. So I'm just gonna pin that in place on both sides and fold the binding up 0.5 centimeters at the bottom. Then just sewing that in the seam allowance value and cutting my top corner off where I have the excess of my zipper folded down, because that is thick. Now I will fold that over, flip the binding over to the back side of my zipper. And I will just do a top stitch down. So I'll just pin it in place first to not have it, you know, move around when I sew. and I'm top stitching it really close to the edge to get a nicer, cleaner finish. And that's what it looks like. So that is the back that's not going to be visible with the overlocked edge. My fabric is borderline too thick to cut my binding from my fabric. Like, it looks a little bulky. When I wear it, it's not really visible, but I just thought I'd mention it. Like, on all of these, I've used the same main fabric as my binding. On this one, it's a little thick, but you know, it's okay. It's okay. Now we're sewing the absolute last part. It's the hem. I'm going to do a double folded hem. It's just gonna be 0.5 meters double folded. If you're doing it in a silk or like a cotton voile, I want to say voile every single time, but that is poultry and that's not what we're talking about. So cotton voile, then you can do 3 millimeters folded twice. And if you do French seams, this is how we are dealing with that in the hem. So folding it over once, cutting the French seam just to the seam, and then folding the bottom of the French seam the opposite direction of the rest of your French seam, then folding your hem and pinning it down. That's just gonna keep it from being too thick. Like, if you just fold your hem on top of your French seam, you're gonna have 3 layers of French seam there, which is like very rough for your machine, and it's gonna be a little bulky as well. So by doing this, by just cutting the French seam and folding it the opposite direction at the bottom, you know, it's gonna look a little bit more delicate. Then I'm just gonna stitch that down, and this is what my hem looks like. And that's it. That is the finished product. Good job. And that's it. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and see you next time. Bye.